I had always hated receiving mail. Bills, junk flyers, the occasional scam letter. All they ever did was remind me how ordinary and unremarkable my life was. But when the envelope arrived, thick and cream-colored, with no return address, I knew this was different. It was addressed to me by name, written in neat, old-fashioned script that seemed almost too perfect. I stopped before opening it, my fingers brushing over the textured surface. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't quite explain why. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in thirds. The handwriting on it matched the envelope, precise, elegant, and unervingly formal. To inherit the estate, you must come to the garden. Midnight. Do not delay. I read the letter 3 times, searching for any clue to its meaning. Estate? What estate? I didn't have any wealthy relatives, no mysterious benefactor who might have left me an inheritance. It had to be some kind of mistake, and yet deep down I knew it wasn't. There was no address included, but the mention of the garden triggered a memory, a place I hadn't thought about in years. It was an overgrown, sprawling maze of hedges that had once been part of a grand estate on the outskirts of town. My friends and I had dared each other to explore it as kids, but none of us had gotten far. The place had an oppressive, eerie silence that made the air feel heavier, thicker, the deeper you went. I hadn't been back since, and as far as I knew, no one had. I told myself I wouldn't go. Midnight? To an abandoned garden? It was absurd, but the hours dragged on, and the letter sat on my kitchen counter, its presence gnawing at me. By the time the clock struck 11, I had already grabbed my coat. I couldn't explain why. The drive to the garden was uneventful, the streets quiet and bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. When I arrived, the gates were already open, their iron bars twisted and rusted with age. The garden was just as I remembered it, dark, sprawling, and unnaturally still. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. As I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The overgrowth that had choked the garden years ago was gone. The hedges were perfectly trimmed, the pathways clear, as though someone had been tending to it all this time. But there was no one there. I followed the path, my breath visible in the cold night air. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The silence was absolute. No rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic, not even the sound of my own footsteps. And then I saw it. At the center of the garden was a stone bench, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. Resting on it was another envelope, identical to the one I had received earlier. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. As I reached for the envelope, I felt it, a cold, invisible presence, watching me from somewhere just out of sight. The cold presence lingered, wrapping around me like a fog I couldn't see but could feel with every nerve. My hand trembled as I picked up the envelope from the stone bench. It felt heavier than the first, though its contents were no different. A single folded sheet of paper, the same elegant handwriting staring back at me. Proceed to the fountain. You must not look behind you. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The instructions were simple, but the last sentence set my heart racing. I turned my head instinctively, scanning the shadows behind me. Nothing, just the neatly trimmed hedges, the moonlight casting long, jagged shapes across the gravel path. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and unnatural. A sudden breeze swept through the garden, carrying with it a faint whisper. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like the suggestion of one, brushing against my ear just enough to make me shiver. I folded the note and shoved it into my pocket. My legs felt stiff as I began to walk, the gravel crunching underfoot. Every step felt like a question. Was I going the right way? Was I being watched? The fountain wasn't hard to find. It stood at the heart of the garden, a massive, ornate structure carved from gray stone. Its once pristine surface was weathered and cracked, but the fountain itself was pristine. Water bubbled gently from its center, rippling across the surface of the shallow basin, though there was no visible source. And there, balanced on the rim of the fountain, was another envelope. My breath hitched. I looked around, hoping, dreading. that someone else was there, but the garden was empty. The presence returned, stronger now, brushing against my back like a cold hand. "Don't look behind you." I grabbed the envelope, fumbling with the seal as my pulse thundered in my ears. The paper inside felt brittle, as though it had been waiting for decades to be read. "Enter the maze. Follow the lanterns. Do not stray from the path." I glanced around, searching for lanterns, but the garden was as dark and empty as before. The fountain gurgled softly behind me, and the faint whispering breeze returned, skimming across my skin. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flicker of light. A small lantern swayed gently in the distance, its warm glow cutting through the darkness. I stopped, gripping the envelope tightly. Something about the light felt wrong. It wasn't inviting or comforting. It was demanding, like a beacon that left no room for refusal. The whispering grew louder, circling me, pushing me forward. With no other choice, I began to follow the lantern's glow. The lantern's glow swayed ahead of me, casting a flickering, amber light over the gravel path. It hung from an iron post that seemed to rise unnaturally from the ground, as though it had grown there rather than been placed. The air was heavier now, damp and cold, with a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The whispering followed me, rising and falling like a distant tide, urging me toward the light. As I approached, the lantern dimmed slightly, its glow softening until it was barely more than a faint ember. Beyond it, another lantern flickered to life, just visible through the twisting hedges of the maze. "Follow the lanterns," I murmured, the words from the note playing over and over in my head. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. But the path behind me was empty, swallowed by the darkness. The first lantern's light extinguished with a soft hiss, leaving me stranded between the second and the void behind. I took another step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. The second lantern stood at a fork in the path, its post leaning slightly, as though it had been there far too long. The hedges on either side of me were taller now, their leaves unnaturally still despite the faint breeze that stirred the air. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I turned toward the glowing light and stopped. Both paths stretched into darkness, but the lantern's light pointed to the left. "Do not stray from the path," I whispered, repeating the note's warning. I took the left turn, my steps uneven as I followed the lantern's flickering glow. The hedges seemed closer now, their leaves brushing against my shoulders, though the path was wide enough to accommodate two people. The lantern ahead of me dimmed, and another appeared, its light drawing me deeper into the maze. The further I went, the harder it became to ignore the whispers. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were words, indistinct, faint, but there. "This way," they seemed to say, their tones soothing and urgent at once. "Keep going." The maze twisted and turned, the lanterns leading me in an unpredictable pattern that made my head spin. The air felt colder with every step, the metallic scent growing stronger, sharper. Then I saw it. Something moved in the hedge ahead of me, just beyond the glow of the next lantern. I froze, my heart pounding, and strained to see through the darkness. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the flickering glow playing tricks on my eyes. But then it moved again, a shadow, shifting unnaturally, too fast and too fluid to belong to anything human. The whispering grew frantic, swirling around me like a whirlwind. "Keep going," the voices said. "Do not stop." The shadow slipped back into the hedge, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't wait. I sprinted toward the next lantern, the whispers roaring in my ears, and stopped just short of its post. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and my hands shook as I gripped the edges of my coat. The next lantern flickered to life further down the path, its light barely visible through the thickening mist. The whispers softened, but one phrase lingered, repeating over and over. "It knows you're here." The whisper's words hung in the air like a chilling echo. "It knows you're here." I stood frozen under the lantern's glow, my breath visible in the icy air. The mist had thickened, wrapping around the hedges and the path ahead like a living thing. The lanterns continued to guide me, their faint glow beckoning me deeper into the maze. But now, I wasn't alone. The shadow I'd seen earlier, it wasn't a figment of my imagination. I could feel it, a presence, heavy and cold, watching me from somewhere just out of sight. "Who's there?" I called, though I regretted it instantly. My voice felt small and out of place in the suffocating silence. The hedge beside me rustled faintly, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shape impossibly tall and thin, slipping between the tightly woven branches. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as the lantern's light flickered overhead. The whispers returned, sharper now, almost frantic. "Keep moving. Do not stop." I forced myself forward, my legs heavy with fear. The lantern ahead of me glowed brighter as I approached, its light cutting through the fog just enough to reveal the path beyond. The air grew colder still, and the metallic tang in my throat became unbearable. It wasn't just a smell anymore, it was a taste sharp and bitter like blood. The next lantern stood at another fork in the path, and I stopped, my eyes darting between the two options. To the right, the path was straight and narrow, the hedges pressed close together like a tunnel. To the left, the mist was thicker, and the light from the next lantern flickered weakly, barely visible through the fog. "Do not stray from the path," I whispered to myself, repeating the note's warning. But which path was the right one? The whispers surged again, their voices layered and overlapping. "Left," they said. "Follow the light." I took a shaky step toward the left path, the cold air biting at my skin. But as I did, the hedge beside me shifted again. This time, the movement was deliberate, purposeful, as though something inside it was following me. The whispers fell silent, and in the stillness, I heard it, a faint, uneven scraping sound, like nails dragging against bark. I spun around, my eyes scanning the hedge. "Who's there?" I demanded, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. The scraping stopped, and then I saw it. Two pale, glistening eyes stared at me from within the hedge, their gaze cold and unblinking. They were too far apart, too large to belong to anything human, and they gleamed faintly in the dim light, like wet glass. My breath caught in my throat as the creature stepped closer, its form still shrouded by the hedge. I could see only fragments, a long, jagged limb here, a twisting, sinewy shape there, but it was enough to make my legs tremble. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "Run! Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted down the left path, my footsteps pounding against the gravel as the lanterns ahead flickered wildly. The whispers chased me, their voices rising in a chaotic frenzy, but they weren't alone. Behind me, I heard it, the scraping sound, faster now, accompanied by the faint rustle of the hedge as the creature followed. The path twisted and turned, the hedges pressing closer as if trying to trap me. The lanterns guided me, their light pulling me forward, but the creature was gaining. Its breath was hot and rancid against the back of my neck, and I didn't dare look back. "Keep going," the whispers urged. "Do not stop. It cannot touch you in the light." I reached the next lantern just as the creature lunged. The light flared brightly, forcing me to shield my eyes, and the air was filled with a guttural, inhuman screech. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. The whispers quieted, their chaotic rhythm softening into a steady hum. But I knew it wasn't over. The lantern ahead flickered, its light waiting. I wasn't safe. Not yet. The lantern's glow stretched out ahead of me, but it felt weaker now, barely cutting through the mist that wrapped itself around the hedges. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing. The screech of the creature still echoed in my ears, its hot, rancid breath a phantom sensation on my skin. The whispers murmured again, their words faint but persistent. "Keep moving. Do not let it catch you." I swallowed hard, wiping the sweat from my brow with a trembling hand. The gravel beneath my boots felt less solid now, as though the very ground of the maze was starting to give way. The air was colder, sharper, the metallic taste stronger than ever. I pushed forward, following the path as it twisted sharply to the right. The hedges seemed closer here, their gnarled branches almost brushing my shoulders. I shuddered at the thought of that thing hiding just out of sight, its pale eyes gleaming from the darkness. The next lantern flickered ahead, its post leaning precariously. As I reached it, the whispers rose, their tone shifting. "You were getting closer." "Closer to what?" I whispered back, though I knew I wouldn't get an answer. The air around the lantern shimmered faintly, and as I passed under its glow, I felt a faint warmth, like a barrier pushing back against the cold. But it didn't last. The moment I stepped beyond its light, the chill returned, more intense than before. The corridor ahead was lined with lanterns, each one flickering weakly as though struggling to stay lit. The path narrowed further, and the hedges on either side twisted together like clawed hands reaching across the space. I stopped, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the whispers grew sharper, more insistent. "Do not stop. It is watching." I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see those pale eyes again. But the path behind me was empty, swallowed by darkness. The first lantern in the corridor dimmed as I approached, its light flickering violently before flaring back to life. Beyond it, the next lantern pulsed in time, and the one beyond that, like a ripple of light drawing me forward. The whispers urged me on, but each step felt heavier. My legs weighed down as though the air itself was trying to hold me back. As I passed the second lantern, the sound returned, the faint scraping, distant at first, but growing louder with each step. The creature was still here. I broke into a run, darting from one pool of light to the next as the lanterns flickered and dimmed. The whispers grew frantic, rising into a that made my head pound. "Faster! Do not stop!" I didn't look back. I couldn't. The scraping sound was closer now, accompanied by the heavy rustle of branches and the faint, guttural rasp of something breathing just behind me. The last lantern in the corridor flared ahead, its light almost blinding against the dark. Beyond it, the path widened, opening into what looked like a clearing. The whispers surged. "You must reach it, now!" The scraping turned into a thunderous roar, and I felt something cold and sharp graze my arm. I stumbled forward, the pain barely registering as I threw myself into the clearing and collapsed under the final lantern's glow. The roar stopped. The whispers fell silent, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. I looked up, clutching my arm, and froze. In the center of the clearing stood a stone pedestal, and on it rested another envelope. The envelope on the pedestal seemed to pulse faintly in the flickering light of the lantern. It was identical to the others, its cream-colored surface untouched, pristine, as though it had been waiting for me. I stopped, the whisper's last frantic cries still echoing in my mind. The clearing was eerily silent now, the oppressive stillness wrapping around me like a second skin. The pain in my arm flared as I straightened up, my sleeve damp and sticky with blood from whatever had grazed me. The pedestal seemed unnaturally cold as I reached for the envelope. The moment my fingers touched it, the whispers returned, soft now, rhythmic like a distant chant. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. The paper inside was as elegant as before, the handwriting precise and deliberate. The path ends at the heart. Do not deviate. Beware the mirrors. The heart. What heart? My pulse quickened as I glanced around the clearing, searching for some sign of what the note meant. The hedges surrounding me were taller and denser here, their tangled branches forming a wall that felt impenetrable. Then I saw it. Beyond the pedestal, a narrow archway was carved into the hedges. It was darker than the rest of the maze, its interior shrouded in shadow, but the faint glow of another lantern flickered in the distance. The whispers shifted, their tone urgent but quieter now. "The heart is near." I stuffed the note into my pocket and stepped toward the archway, the gravel crunching faintly beneath my boots. The air grew colder as I approached, and the metallic tang in my throat became stronger, making my stomach churn. As I passed through the arch, the space beyond revealed itself. Another corridor lined with mirrors. mirrors. They were massive, each one stretching from the ground to the top of the hedges, their ornate frames gleaming faintly in the lantern light. The glass was dark, almost black, reflecting only the faintest outline of the corridor itself. The whispers grew sharper. "Do not look too closely." I moved cautiously, keeping my gaze fixed on the ground. The path was narrow here, the mirrors on either side looming over me like silent sentinels. My own faint reflection flickered in and out of view as I passed, distorted and fragmented. The air was heavy, and with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I glanced at one of the mirrors, just for a second, and froze. The reflection wasn't mine. It was my face, my body, but wrong. The eyes were too wide, unblinking, the mouth twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the reflection moved with me, its grin widening. The whispers surged. "Do not linger. Keep going." I tore my gaze away and kept walking, the path twisting and turning in impossible ways. The mirrors seemed to follow me, their surfaces warping and rippling as I passed, though I refused to look at them again. The scraping sound returned, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the corridor. "It's still here," I whispered, my voice trembling. The lantern ahead flickered, and for a moment, I thought it would go out. The whispers rose into a frantic hum, pushing me forward. I reached the end of the corridor just as the scraping grew louder, accompanied by the faint rustle of movement in the mirrors. Another archway appeared, this one carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The whispers quieted as I stepped through, and the air grew colder still. Beyond the arch was another clearing, and at its center stood an enormous tree. Its gnarled branches twisted into the sky, and its roots stretched across the ground like grasping fingers. The tree's bark was black, glistening faintly, and at its base was a single, glowing lantern. The whispers spoke again, soft and reverent. "The heart." The tree loomed before me, its massive branches clawing at the misty sky. The bark, black and glossy, seemed to shimmer as if it were alive, pulsating with an energy that radiated through the clearing. The lantern at its base glowed faintly, its light casting flickering shadows that danced across the twisted roots, spreading out like a web. The whispers were quiet now, murmuring indistinctly in the back of my mind, urging me forward. I approached cautiously, the metallic tang in the air growing stronger with each step. The closer I got, the more the tree seemed to shift, its form bending and twisting subtly, as though it were watching me. When I reached the lantern, I saw that it wasn't sitting on the ground. It was hanging, suspended by an iron chain wrapped tightly around the tree's trunk. The chain disappeared into a deep fissure in the bark, the lantern's light flickering weakly. The whispers rose, their tones sharp and insistent. The key must be placed. The heart must be opened. My pulse quickened. "What key?" I muttered, though I already knew the answer. The brass key in my pocket felt impossibly heavy, its edges biting into my palm as I pulled it out. The moment it touched the air, the lantern's glow grew brighter, its light casting long shadows across the clearing. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Place the key. Open the heart." I stopped, staring at the fissure in the tree's trunk. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for the key, and it seemed to pulse faintly, as though the tree itself was alive. "What happens if I do?" I asked aloud, my voice trembling. The whispers didn't answer. Instead, the air grew colder, and the shadows around the clearing seemed to press closer. The scraping sound returned, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep within the tree. The whispers softened, almost pleading. "The heart must be opened." My hands shook as I lifted the key. The tree seemed to lean toward me, its glossy bark glistening in the lantern's flickering light. I placed the key into the fissure. The moment it slid into place, the clearing erupted with light. The lantern flared brilliantly, its glow illuminating every inch of the tree. The whispers rose into a deafening crescendo, their overlapping voices forming a single, chilling word. "Awaken!" The tree shuddered violently, its branches creaking and groaning as the fissure widened. The bark peeled away, revealing a hollow interior that glowed with a sickly, pulsating light. Inside, something moved. A shadowy form, coiled and writhing, began to emerge from the hollow. Its shape was indistinct, shifting and twisting as though it were made of smoke and darkness. The scraping sound grew louder, reverberating through the clearing, and the whispers faltered, replaced by a low, guttural growl. The shadow unfurled, its form towering over me. Two pale, glistening eyes opened within the darkness, fixing me with an unblinking stare. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented. "It is awake." The shadow's eyes bore into me, pale and glistening, their hollow intensity paralyzing. It didn't move, not in the way a creature might, but it twisted and shifted, its form rippling like smoke caught in an invisible wind. The lantern's glow dimmed, its light flickering weakly as the tree groaned. The hollow in the trunk pulsed with the same sickly, greenish glow as the shadow, casting jagged, moving shapes across the clearing. The whispers had changed, no longer urging. They were fragmented, fractured into incoherent murmurs that overlapped and fought for space in my mind. I stepped back, my legs trembling. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice barely audible over the growing hum in the air. The shadow didn't answer, not in words. Instead, it unfurled further, its shifting mass filling the space between the tree's branches. It was vast, its presence pressing down on the clearing like an unseen weight. The scraping sound returned, louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadow's form twisted again, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something within it. Faces distorted and fleeting, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers surged again, their fragmented voices weaving together into a single, chilling phrase. "It has been waiting. Waiting for what?" I shouted, the metallic tang in the air so strong it made me gag. The lantern flickered, its light shrinking further as the shadow moved closer. It didn't step or crawl. It flowed, its form shifting as though it were part of the air itself. The whispers answered, their tone both reverent and mournful. "For you." My stomach turned, and I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs as the shadow loomed over me. Its eyes glowed brighter now, twin orbs of cold, unfeeling light that seemed to pierce straight through me. The key in the tree glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the shadow's movements. The fissure widened further, and from deep within the hollow, I heard it, something breathing. The air around me grew impossibly cold, and the whispers fell silent. For a moment, the clearing was utterly still, the shadow frozen, its eyes locked on mine. And then it spoke. "You brought me back." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice, not really. It was a sound that crawled into my mind and filled every corner of my thoughts, heavy and alien. I shook my head, scrambling to my feet. "I didn't mean to. I don't even know what this is." The shadow shifted again, its form rippling as it extended a long, jagged limb. "The key is the beginning. The door is the end." The whispers returned, faint but urgent. "Run." The shadow surged forward, its mass twisting and coiling as it reached for me. The lantern flared weakly, its light pushing the edges of the shadow back, but it wasn't enough. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted toward the archway. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, the roots of the tree shifting and writhing as though they were alive. Behind me, the shadow roared, a sound that shook the air and sent shockwaves through the clearing. The whispers screamed in unison, "Do not stop." The roar of the shadow was deafening, reverberating through the clearing as I ran. The air itself seemed to warp around me, heavy and suffocating, the metallic tang thick on my tongue. The path twisted sharply as I reached the archway, and the ground beneath my feet shifted like it was alive. The hedges on either side swayed unnaturally, their branches curling inward, as though trying to trap me. Behind me, the shadow surged, its form a writhing mass of darkness that spilled out from the tree. The scraping sound was louder now, like claws dragging across stone, and with every step I could feel its cold presence closing in. The whispers screamed, their voices frenzied. "Keep moving. Do not let it touch you." The lanterns along the path flared weakly, their light flickering as I passed. Each one felt like a fragile barrier, a brief reprieve from the suffocating cold. But the shadow was relentless. I didn't dare look back. The memory of those pale, unblinking eyes was enough to keep me running. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the whispers didn't let up. "Faster! It is coming!" The path ahead curved again, and I stumbled as the ground shifted beneath me. My hands scraped against the gravel, the pain sharp but distant compared to the cold creeping closer. I pushed myself up and kept running, the faint glow of another lantern guiding me forward. And then the path ended. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving as I stared at the wall of hedges blocking my way. The lantern above flickered weakly, its light barely illuminating the dead end. "No," I whispered, panic surging through me. "No, no, no." The whispers fell silent, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint rustle of the hedges. The cold presence behind me grew stronger. Slowly I turned. The shadow loomed at the edge of the lantern's glow, its massive form shifting and twisting. Its pale eyes glowed brighter now, unblinking as they bore into mine. The lantern flickered again, its light dimming. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost mournful. "It cannot reach you in the light." But the lantern's glow was failing. The shadow crept closer, its jagged limbs stretching toward the edges of the light. The ground beneath it seemed to crumble, swallowed by the darkness, and I felt the cold seep into my bones. I backed against the hedge, my hands trembling. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadow didn't answer. It didn't need to. Its eyes said everything. Hunger, rage, inevitability. The whispers spoke again, faint and desperate. "The key. Use the key." My hand shot to my pocket, the brass key burning against my palm. The light from the lantern flared weakly as I pulled it out, its surface glowing faintly. The shadow, its form rippling as though reacting to the key's presence. "Turn it," the whispers urged. "Turn it and end this." But there was nothing to turn. No lock, no door, just the hedge behind me and the crushing presence of the shadow. The lantern dimmed further, its glow shrinking to a faint ember. The shadow lunged. The shadow surged forward, its jagged limbs cutting through the shrinking light. The lantern's glow sputtered, barely holding it at bay, and the cold presence around me was overwhelming, like being swallowed by the deep sea. The whispers screamed now, their voices overlapping in desperate urgency. "Turn the key. Do it now." "But where?" My eyes darted around the dead-end path, frantic for something, anything, that would make sense. The hedge behind me was solid, its twisted branches forming an impenetrable wall, and the lantern above hung useless, its light faltering. The shadow lunged closer, its eyes like pale, hollow moons. I gripped the key tightly, the heat of it almost unbearable. What am I supposed to do? I shouted, my voice breaking. Then, as the shadow's limbs stretched toward me, I saw it, a faint, glowing outline in the hedge behind me, a shape that hadn't been there before. A lock. The whispers surged again. "Now!" I spun around, shoving the key into the glowing shape. The hedge seemed to shift and ripple under my touch, the branches curling away as the key slid into place. The shadow let out a deafening roar, the sound vibrating through the air and rattling my teeth. Its limbs thrashed wildly, clawing at the edges of the light, as though trying to reach me before it was too late. I turned the key. The ground beneath me shuddered violently, and the hedge dissolved, revealing a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The air was filled with an otherworldly hum, low and resonant, that seemed to vibrate in my chest. The shadow froze, its pale eyes narrowing. "You cannot seal me again," it growled, its voice layered and inhuman. The door has been opened. I turn the key again, the motion dragging against some unseen resistance. The vortex surged, its light growing brighter, and the shadow recoiled, its form unraveling at the edges. The whispers returned, triumphant now. Turn it once more. With all my strength, I twisted the key a final time. The vortex exploded with light, blinding and all-consuming. The shadow let out a scream that rattled through the air. Its massive form pulled toward the vortex like smoke caught in a gale. I collapsed to the ground, shielding my eyes as the light consumed everything. The air around me shifted, the cold fading as the whispers softened into silence. When I opened my eyes, the maze was gone. I was lying in the center of the garden, the stone pedestal standing before me. The lantern on its surface was unlit, its chain hanging limply. The key lay in my hand, cool and dull, its glow extinguished. The garden was silent again. The mist was gone, the hedges still and ordinary. But I knew better than to think it was over. The whispers might have stopped, and the shadow might have been sealed, but the garden still waited, its presence lingering in the edges of my mind. I stood slowly, staring at the pedestal and the unlit lantern. The garden had chosen me once. It would choose again,